Breaking news is shaking both Washington and Ottawa tonight. Former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, now one of Canada's most influential voices on economic policy, has made a bold demand. He says Canada needs urgent access to more household goods and essential supplies to protect families from soaring costs and supply chain shocks. But in a move that stunned many, Donald Trump, eyeing his political comeback and flexing America's economic muscle, slammed the door shut. The message from Trump was crystal clear: America's goods are for America first. This clash isn't just about trade, it's about power, sovereignty, and the fragile relationship between the United States and Canada. Carney's call represents the growing fear that Canada could be left behind in a global scramble for resources. Trump's rejection signals that the U.S. is preparing to circle the wagons, prioritizing domestic security over neighborly cooperation. The result? Shockwaves across North America, with experts warning of a potential economic implosion in Canada if supply shortages worsen. So, what's really going on here? Why does this matter so much for ordinary families on both sides of the border? And what could happen next if these two economic heavyweights refuse to budge? Introduced in 300 words. To understand the drama unfolding right now, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Canada and the United States have one of the closest trading partnerships in the world. Every single day, billions of dollars in goods cross that border, everything from lumber and oil to food and electronics. For decades, this relationship has been the backbone of North America's stability. But when that bond is tested, the ripple effects are enormous. Mark Carney isn't just any Canadian voice. He's a global heavyweight who's advised governments, led major banks, and shaped international economic policy. When Carney says Canada needs to secure more access to essential goods, he's not making a casual remark. He's ringing alarm bells about the vulnerability of the Canadian economy. Rising inflation, energy instability, and global supply chain bottlenecks have already hit Canadian households hard. And now, Carney is warning that without stronger guarantees from trading partners, things could get a lot worse. On the other side, Donald Trump represents a growing trend in American politics: economic nationalism. His America First agenda is about protecting U.S. resources, ensuring domestic industries thrive, and keeping goods inside American borders before they're shipped abroad. For Trump, rejecting Carney's demand wasn't just a political move. It was a symbolic declaration that the U.S. will put its own survival above all else. The timing couldn't be more critical. With elections looming in both countries, and with global uncertainty rising, this dispute highlights a fundamental question. What happens when neighbors who've always relied on each other suddenly turn inward? Could we be witnessing the early stages of a North American trade fracture? Or is this just political theater meant to rally voters? Number 1. The historical partnership at stake. To really understand why Carney's demand and Trump's rejection matter so much, we need to step back and look at the long history between the United States and Canada. For over a century, these two countries have been more than neighbors. They've been economic partners, military allies, and cultural cousins. The U.S.-Canada border is the longest undefended border in the world, and that fact alone speaks volumes. Trust, cooperation, and interdependence have been the foundation of their relationship. Trade has always been at the center of that bond. From Canadian lumber fueling American housing booms to U.S. technology powering Canadian industries, the flow of goods across the border has shaped both economies. World War II was a turning point. Canada and the U.S. built war supplies together, trained soldiers side by side, and coordinated resources like no other allies. After the war, both countries leaned into free trade, culminating in the 1989 Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which later expanded into NAFTA and today's USMCA. Billions of dollars now move daily across the border, creating one of the strongest trade partnerships in the world. But history also teaches us that this partnership has cracks. Disputes over softwood lumber have dragged on for decades. Canada's protection of its dairy sector has sparked repeated arguments, and under Trump's first presidency, U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum triggered retaliatory measures from Ottawa, straining the relationship. Yet through all these tensions, both countries managed to come back to the table and find a way forward, because neither side could afford a prolonged break. Today's clash feels different because it touches the heart of everyday life: household goods. lumber or dairy disputes are important, but they don't usually cause families to worry about affording groceries or finding cleaning supplies on store shelves. If the U.S. cuts Canada off from basic consumer goods, the consequences will hit Canadians where it hurts most: the family budget. For the U.S., the stakes are also high because Canada is America's largest export market. Punishing a neighbor risks punishing U.S. companies that rely on Canadian customers. That's why Carney's demand and Trump's rejection strike at something much deeper than a policy disagreement. They challenge the very spirit of partnership that has defined U.S.-Canada relations for generations. If that bond begins to unravel, it won't just be politicians who feel it, it will be families on both sides of the border. Number 2. Canada's vulnerability in global supply chains. When Mark Carney raised the alarm about household goods, he wasn't exaggerating. Canada's economy is uniquely exposed when it comes to supply chains, and that's because of its size, geography, and industrial structure. Unlike the U.S., which has a vast internal market and massive domestic manufacturing capacity, Canada depends heavily on imports for everyday items, from food and medicine to electronics and consumer goods. This isn't a flaw in planning. It's simply the reality of a country with a smaller population and fewer production hubs. Think about it this way: while the U.S. can produce much of what its population needs inside its borders, Canada has always relied on the fact that its closest ally and largest trading partner is right next door. American factories, farms, and distribution networks have been Canada's lifeline. But that dependency becomes a major risk when political winds shift in Washington. If America decides to put up walls, figuratively or literally, Canada suddenly finds itself scrambling to source the basics. The COVID-19 pandemic was a wake-up call. Canadians saw firsthand how quickly supply chains could collapse when borders tightened and demand spiked globally. Even items as simple as cleaning wipes and basic medical supplies became hard to find. For many, it revealed just how much Canada leans on international supply chains, and particularly on the U.S., to keep households functioning smoothly. Carney's warning reflects a real fear that Canada is one major policy shift away from empty shelves or skyrocketing prices. Essential goods don't just affect comfort, they affect security. Families need affordable groceries, reliable medicine, and access to daily necessities. If these supplies become scarce, the pressure on Canadian households will be immediate and severe. Inflation, already a hot topic in Canada, would soar further, straining families who are already budgeting tightly. The bigger issue is that Canada doesn't have easy alternatives. Building new supply chains with Europe or Asia takes years, and even then, shipping costs and geopolitical risks make those routes less reliable. That leaves Canada in a tough spot: either push harder for U.S. cooperation or make massive, long-term investments in domestic production. Something easier said than done. This is why Carney's voice carries weight. He's not warning about a distant threat. He's pointing out a vulnerability that Canadians can already feel. Without reliable access to U.S. goods, Canada's economy is exposed like never before, and Trump's rejection only magnifies that fragility. Number 3. Trump's America First revival. Donald Trump's decision to slam the door on Carney's request is more than a single act of political defiance. It's the clearest sign yet that his America First philosophy is roaring back to life. During his first term as president, Trump reshaped America's trade and foreign policy with a laser focus on self-interest. Whether it was imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, renegotiating NAFTA into the USMCA, or putting tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, his message was simple: America would no longer play the role of the world's supplier at its own expense. That message resonated with millions of Americans who felt globalization had hollowed out their communities. By rejecting Carney's demand for more household goods, Trump is returning to that same playbook. He's sending a signal to American workers, voters, and businesses that he is committed to shielding U.S. resources from foreign dependence. In his eyes, every truckload of goods that crosses the border is one less item available to American families. Politically, it's a smart move. It appeals to national pride, reinforces his image as a fighter for American interests, and positions him as the one leader willing to say no to international pressure. But beneath the political theater lies a complex reality. America First policies may benefit certain industries in the short term, but they often trigger retaliation. Canada, for example, has pushed back against Trump's tariffs in the past, slapping its own tariffs on U.S. products. That tit-for-tat can hurt businesses on both sides of the border and ultimately trickle down to consumers in the form of higher prices. There's also a deeper risk: alienating allies. Canada has historically been one of America's most dependable partners, not only in trade but also in defense, intelligence, and diplomacy. By slamming the door in such a public way, Trump risks sending the message that America's alliances are conditional, transactional, and expendable. Other allies around the world are paying close attention, wondering if they might be next in line to face an America first barrier. For Trump, however, the calculation is clear. In an election cycle, bold moves play well with his base. The optics of protecting American shelves from foreign demands far outweigh the long-term diplomatic fallout, at least for now. What remains uncertain is whether this revival of economic nationalism will strengthen America's economy in the long run or leave it more isolated on the global stage. Number 4. The ripple effect on ordinary families. Big political clashes often sound distant, but this one has a very real human cost, and it's households, not politicians, who will feel the first shockwaves. For Canadians, Trump's rejection of Carney's call could translate into higher grocery bills, fewer choices in stores, and shortages of everyday goods. Imagine walking into a supermarket in Toronto or Vancouver and seeing limited options for basic items like pasta, baby formula, or cleaning products. When supply chains tighten, the shelves empty quickly and prices soar. For families already stretched by inflation, that extra 20 or 30 on the weekly grocery bill is not just inconvenient, it's painful. For American families, the effects may seem less dramatic at first. Trump's policy is designed to keep goods inside the U.S., which could mean slightly lower prices or better availability for American households in the short run. But it's not all upside. If Canada retaliates with tariffs or restricts its own exports, U.S. businesses could be hurt. Farmers in the Midwest, for example, rely heavily on Canadian buyers for their crops. Car manufacturers in Detroit depend on parts crossing the border daily. If that flow slows down, jobs and wages in the U.S. could be at risk. The ripple effects go even deeper. Canadian businesses struggling with shortages might cut back on production or lay off workers, creating a domino effect across industries. Families in Canada could see not only higher costs at the checkout line, but also fewer job opportunities. In the U.S., companies facing retaliatory tariffs may scale back exports, leaving American workers caught in the middle of a trade dispute. Beyond economics, there's also the psychological impact. Ordinary families thrive on a sense of stability, knowing they can afford groceries, keep the lights on, and plan for the future. When that sense of security is shaken, anxiety rises. Parents worry about whether they'll be able to provide for their kids. Seniors on fixed incomes fear their budgets won't stretch far enough. A policy decision made in Washington can quickly translate into a dinner table conversation about what to cut from the family budget. In short, while Trump and Carney battle on the world stage, it's ordinary families who will pay the price. Whether through higher bills, job insecurity, or growing uncertainty, the ripple effect of this dispute will land hardest in the homes of everyday Canadians and Americans. Number 5. The global implications. What makes this story truly explosive is that it doesn't stop at the U.S.-Canada border. The entire world is watching how this clash unfolds, because it could set a precedent for the future of global trade. If the United States is willing to shut out Canada, its closest ally and most reliable trading partner, what does that say about the security of its commitments to other countries? Allies in Europe, Asia, and Latin America are already reassessing their relationships with Washington. If America signals that its goods are off limits, even to friends, countries may look elsewhere for stability. That could mean stronger trade ties between Canada and Europe through the CETA agreement, or even closer cooperation with China, which has long sought to expand its influence in North America. Such shifts would reshape the balance of power in ways that might not favor Washington in the long run. The global supply chain system also hangs in the balance. Since World War II, the United States has played the role of anchor, guaranteeing open markets and reliable flows of goods. That system has fueled decades of prosperity worldwide. But if America begins prioritizing domestic security over international cooperation, we could see a fragmentation of the global economy. Regional blocs might replace global networks, with countries choosing to trade only within tight circles of allies. For Canada, the implications are especially sharp. Being shut out by the U.S. could push Ottawa into uncomfortable partnerships. Turning to China, for example, might help in the short term but would carry serious political risks, given tensions over human rights and security concerns. Strengthening ties with Europe could provide a lifeline, but the logistics of shipping across the Atlantic are far more costly and complex than trucking goods across the U.S. border. For the rest of the world, this dispute is a case study in uncertainty. Nations will be asking if America won't prioritize Canada. Why should we expect it to prioritize us? The result could be a new wave of self-sufficiency, protectionism, and shifting alliances. And once those changes take root, they won't be easy to reverse. In other words, the fallout from Trump and Carney's standoff isn't just about household goods. It's about the future of global trade, the strength of international alliances, and the possibility that we are entering a new era of fractured, region-based economies. The stakes could not be higher.